Well, hello again. Thank you very much to the chair for giving me this opportunity to complete my presentation. You'll remember that in my earlier intervention I rather let things get away from me, and I had to interrupt before I'd got to the second part of my presentation, but I've been told that we have time for that now, so thank you very much for that, Chair. And let me also start by thanking the interpreters at this mock conference at ISIT for the work they've done so far and the work that they're going to be doing over the course of this presentation and the rest of the day. And I should also perhaps apologise at the same time for not having sent in my speaking notes. Usually I would have done that, but I'm afraid that they were handwritten on the train last night, and I fear that they wouldn't necessarily be terribly useful for you. So I shall try to be clear and hope that you don't suffer too much as a result of my not having sent them to you. So what is it that I wanted to do with this second half of the presentation? Well, I think I said I wanted to outline the interpreting market or markets that you're about to go out onto once you leave interpreting school. I'm going to focus on Paris, but I think it is important for me to give a little disclaimer right at the beginning. What I'm going to say is a very personal vision of the interpreting markets that I'm familiar with. It's by no means an exhaustive view of the interpreting markets. It's not necessarily completely correct. I mean, I think it's all correct, but it's my experience of the market. I'll focus a little bit on Paris because I think that's going to be more useful to you. But my view is, of course, heavily influenced by my language combination, which is, to remind you, French, German and Polish into English, but I don't have a retour language, so I don't work back into any of my languages. The other important thing I think is worth mentioning before we start talking about markets is that Paris is a collection of markets, plural. It's sometimes people say, "Oh, the Paris market," singular. My experience is that Paris is dozens and dozens of small markets where interpreters sort of cling together or work with the same teams and the same people in the same places because they have those language combinations or because they've been there for a few years already. And I think it can be a mistake to consider Paris a single uniform market. My experience is that it's lots and lots of quite different markets with different degrees of difficulty, different working conditions and different rates. So let me start with perhaps the area of the profession that I know best, and that's the institutional markets. I work mostly in international institutions. Most institutions will have accreditation tests, and the basic setup for their work is that you work passive languages into an A language, but there are lots of exceptions to that. Now, in Paris, we're quite lucky. Paris is one of the big institutional centres in Europe. I think you could probably count Geneva, Brussels and Paris as the big interpreting centres of Europe and therefore the world. And in Paris, we have the UN in the shape of UNESCO. There's the Council of Europe that has offices here. And there's the OECD, which is quite a big employer. The European Space Agency, the slightly smaller Union Internationale des Chemins de Fer, so the railway union institution, and possibly some others that I have forgotten. I think I would count actually the French Foreign Ministry as an institution as well. The Quai d'Orsay is a big employer of interpreters. One thing about institutions is that they don't like to pay travel costs if they have to. So if you're aiming at an institution, it's useful to live in the same place as the institution. So a lot of colleagues working for the EU will move to Brussels. A lot of colleagues trying to work for the UN will move to Geneva, etc. And it obviously makes you a more attractive prospect to employers if they only have to pay your fee and not travel costs as well. So what are the advantages of institutional work, working for international institutions? Well, some of the institutions come with special low tax rates or even tax-free, or the income falls outside of national tax systems. So that would be the case for the UN, for the Council of Europe, and for the EU. Another perhaps underrated advantage is that institutional employers tend to be quite big employers. They give you a lot of work. That means you have fewer customers. It means you have to do less invoicing. And you certainly don't have to chase up the bills. They're very good payers. And that saves a lot of time. My experience of private customers is that you often have to chase them up for money, and that takes time. Another advantage of institutional work is that you often get pension contributions paid by the employer. And that's not an insignificant amount. For the EU, for example, it's €130 per day going into a pension contribution. Going into a pension pot, I beg your pardon. Another advantage of the institutional setup is that they're often the rates are often collectively bargained. For example, with ISIT, the International Association of Conference Interpreters. So the rates aren't negotiable, but they are guaranteed and they are protected. And very often they're also index linked against inflation. That's quite an important point. Looking back over the last 5 years, where inflation has spiked during COVID and since. And a final advantage of the institutions, they recruit early. There's competition for interpreters. They like to plan ahead. They know they've got a lot of work coming. And so they'll recruit at 6 weeks' notice and even at 6 months or 9 months' notice with options or provisional recruitments. Whereas the private market is a much shorter term affair. So what about the disadvantages? I think the big disadvantage of institutional work is to think that it's safe and that it'll last forever. My experience is that every 10 years or so there's some big structural change and the bottom drops out of a market. Suddenly there's no work available. I, for example, lost 40% of my work in 2010 as a direct result of the financial crisis and its impact on the European Parliament. Suddenly, my only customer at that time was giving me 40% less work. Similarly, in COVID, it wasn't the case for me. During COVID, I diversified by then, but many interpreters working exclusively with the EU suddenly had no work at all. Although, to be fair, no interpreters had any work during COVID. So you can be lulled into a false sense of security in the institutions. Put all your eggs in one basket and be at risk of structural shifts that affect interpreting demand. So what about the private market? Well, one thing I would say is a bit of good news. The private market in Paris is gigantic. So the only statistics I've ever seen are not very recent. They're from about 2010. But they had the Paris market at 90,000 interpreter days per year. So that's 900 interpreters working 100 days a year. And that 100 is a sort of fairly good benchmark. I think as a beginner you won't be working that much, but it's an easy round number to aim at. So it's an awful lot of interpreters working a lot. And that number's probably actually gone up since COVID because remote interpreting has actually expanded the market rather than shrunk it. And that number, 90,000 days, just to put it into perspective, is very similar to the total recruitment of interpreters at the EU Commission. In the same year, 2010, the EU Commission recruited 100,000 interpreter days per year. And just remember, they have 23 languages, 400 staff interpreters, and hundreds of freelancers. So the Paris market is a very big one. Mostly, the Paris market is biactive. So it's either French-English or French-German or French Russian or French Chinese, with interpreters working in both directions. But the rates will vary enormously between customers and possibly even between language combinations. I'm not really familiar with what other language combinations are earning. But as I say, the market is very, very fragmented. There are lots of little markets, and it can often seem very difficult to get into any of the new sort of mini sub-markets that exist. And this is what I was saying in my earlier intervention about reputation being so important. You've just got to keep on being out there, showing the best side of yourself, being professional, and hoping that at some stage you'll get picked up and drawn into one of these or several of these newer gigs. There's a lot of talk online about interpreters winning direct clients, and this is obviously relevant for the private market. But I would say you don't necessarily have to worry about that too much. I mean, first of all, there are the institutions. They recruit, so that is, if you like, a direct client, but you didn't have to go and find them. But most interpreters are recruited by other interpreters or by the Secretariat here in Paris. The secretariats are a sort of collective where interpreters pay a fixed annual membership fee, and the Secretariat will receive calls asking for interpreters, and they will dish out the work to the various interpreters on their books, depending on who's free. And of course, mathematically, it makes sense that interpreters don't all have direct clients. At a given meeting, you might have 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 interpreters. Only one of that number can be the direct supplier to the customer, whereas 5 or 6 or 7, the others, are not in direct contact with the customer. And indeed, I've survived 30 years in the profession without ever having a direct customer or negotiating a rate with anybody. Now, the private market has some advantages. It's very diverse. It can be very interesting as a result. You can be doing all sorts of things from gas turbines to fashion shows to cosmetics to pharmaceuticals. It's very, very diverse. On the downside, you have to chase up your customers, and you'll have a lot of customers. You might find that for 100 days' work, you have 70 different customers. That means 70 invoices. And private customers are not such good payers. You might have to chase them up. You might have to do a bit more admin. And your tax declaration, of course, gets more complicated as you do more taxable private market work. The other big disadvantage, I think, of the private market is that recruitment has become very last minute. People will be ringing up, offering you an option for the next day, not even a confirmed offer for the next day sometimes. But recruitment a few days ahead or a week ahead is considered perfectly normal. So it's quite difficult to plan your life. And there are periods in our lives where that's fine. We're free. We can do what we like. And there are other periods in our lives where we'd like sort of 6 months visibility on what's coming our way, and the private market might not be so convenient. So I've just had a quick look at the clock, and I see time marching on. That is a quick whistle-stop tour of the Parisian interpreting markets as I see them. Again, big caveat, I don't claim that to have been an exhaustive examination of the various markets in Paris. Very much my personal view, influenced by my own path through those markets. But I hope that it's been useful to you as you head off into the real world this summer. So I think it remains only for me to wish you good luck with the end of your studies, good luck with your exams, and your first steps out in the big wide real world starting this summer. And thank you, of course, to the chair for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.